Emanuele. Welcome on BioBlue.com.
Thanks for having me.
So I read an article from you. It was called "I Helped Create ISIS." Can you tell us about your experience in Iraq 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, it's been 10 years of anti-war activism since coming home from Iraq. I joined the Marine Corps at 18 years old, a young kid from a manufacturing area, I think very similar to a lot of my friends in the area. Not a lot of jobs around, not a lot of educational opportunities. Decided to join the Marine Corps, and the timing was sort of horrifically perfect. I joined the Marine Corps in 2002 in September, went to boot camp, graduated boot camp in December, went to the School of Infantry in 2003 in January, and then graduated the School of Infantry at the end of February, right before the initial invasion in Iraq. So the article that I just wrote sort of details my experiences during the second time I was deployed to Iraq. And this was in 2004, August, till April of 2005. We were stationed in western Iraq, the Al-Anbar province, in a town called Al-Qaim, which is located right on the Syrian border. Today, obviously, that has a lot of importance, and some of your listeners and viewers might recognize that area as being an area that is now controlled by ISIS. Back then, as a friend of mine was just telling me last night and reminding me, a gentleman that I served with in the same platoon, at the time we were in Iraq, it was largely in the areas that we control, or in the areas that we patrolled. It was militant Sunni groups, Al-Qaeda groups, and the groups who were fighting us in that region, varied. So there were dozens of different groups. Some of them were bandits. Some of them were involved with drug cartels. Some of them were involved with criminal operations. Some of them were just the local population who was resisting against us. And then some of them were more, associated with radical groups like Al-Qaeda and then what eventually became ISIS. So what I wanted to do in the article was to provide some of my own personal experiences and my anecdotal experiences about being in Iraq and seeing the kind of savagery that the U.S. forces were inflicting on the Iraqi people. It was actually one of the first things that I noticed. I mean, it was a very simple conversation with friends, asking each other, what would you do or what would you think if we were in the shoes of the Iraqi people? So switch our positions, and what would you feel like, or how would I feel if my mother was being treated like this, if my father was being zip-tied and black-bagged and tortured? What would I do if my cousins or my brother had been killed by a foreign occupying military force? And very quickly, it became clear to me that there would be consequences for what we did in Iraq. And what we did in Iraq was very horrific. People shooting at innocent civilians, people blowing up buildings of innocent civilians, people torturing innocent civilians, people maiming and playing with dead bodies, taking pictures and mutilating dead corpses, laughing sometimes while doing so. These are the sort of brutal aspects of the war in Iraq that a lot of the people in the West, not just the United States, but also the broader West, have not really heard stories like this. We hear these stories about Korea or the war in Vietnam, or we hear these stories about the French in Malaysia, the British in Malaysia, or the French in Algeria. All of these counterinsurgency operations, all of these imperial military operations have many things similar in common. But one of the biggest things they have in common is the brutality that was inflicted on the indigenous population by the foreign occupying force. So unfortunately, none of this is new. What I'm writing about in that recent article is what I've been talking about and organizing around for the last 10 years. And a good portion of the anti-war movement in the United States and around the world have actually talked about these issues for over a decade now. You know, groups in the United States like Veterans for Peace, Iraq Veterans Against the War, these organizations have had hundreds of veterans testify and tell their stories about what it is they experienced in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we found so amazing through this process was that people who served at different times, some people in 2004, some people in 2008, some people in Western Iraq, some people in Eastern Iraq, some people in Northern Afghanistan, veterans from Southern Afghanistan, all reporting the same stories: torture, mutilation of bodies, killing of innocent civilians, unclear objectives, corruption within the military, contractors making out with tons of money. So corporations and private corporations like Halliburton, like KBR, like the weapons manufacturers, and so on. All of these stories became very similar. So we started to see a continuity of what was happening in this war. And then what a lot of us did, myself included, was to go back and look at previous counterinsurgency campaigns. How similar were our stories in Iraq and Afghanistan to what was experienced in Vietnam? How similar was the stories in Vietnam to what the British were doing in Malaysia, what the French were doing in Algeria, so on and so on. And so what I would like to get across to people with that article is to get people in the West to understand that the U.S. military, NATO forces, Western military occupations are a source for insecurity and instability, whereas many people in the West assume that military occupations, particularly NATO or what is so-called humanitarian interventions, that the military can provide a source of stability and security. We need to challenge that narrative. We have to challenge that narrative and get people in the West to understand, because people in the Middle East already understand. People in North Africa, they already understand. They understand exactly what French military occupation looks like, what American military occupation looks like, what British military occupation looks like. They understand it. People in the West still believe that the military can be used as a form of security and stability. And what we need to do, I think, as activists, as thinkers, as critical people in this world, is to challenge that narrative. And I think one of the ways to do so is for veterans to tell their stories, to explain to people that the occupation itself is not providing safety and security to the people of Iraq, but is quite the opposite. The more bombs that are dropped by the West, the more drone strikes by the West, the more proxy armies that are armed by the West, the more people that we assassinate, the more insecurity and instability there will be. The people in the Middle East and around the world have had it up to their ears with American military interventions. They can no longer stand this, and the consequences are clear. Some estimates say that 250,000 Iraqis were killed. Other estimates say that upwards of 1.5 million Iraqis were killed. There was a study that was recently released and reported on Telesur English, a media entity that I write for, that said between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan in the last 14 years, the United States is responsible for over 1.3 million deaths. And understanding that makes it easier for people in the West to understand the question that everybody, I think, naively asks, which is, why do they hate us? And this is something we have yet to explore since 9/11. We have yet to have a serious conversation about why it is people around the world, but particularly people in the Middle East and North Africa, would want to bomb, shoot, kill, etc., people in the West, and what that blowback is going to look like in the coming years.
Okay, I posted I shared your article yesterday, and there were some questions for you.
Yes.
First of all, did you participate in those tortures, or you just saw it, or you heard about it?
Yes. So number one, saw a lot of it, And number two, I heard the stories, as I mentioned in the article. And most of those stories for a lot of us, they would be things people would talk about in the evening. People would talk about while they're on patrol, when they have 5 or 10 minutes to take a break, or to, sit around when there's long periods of doing nothing. People would tell these stories. And some of it was witnessed, some of it, as I mentioned in the article, was simply stories that I heard from fellow Marines. So what can I say about that? So people often will ask, why is it that people didn't report? Or why is it that people didn't turn these torturers in, right? Why weren't there consequences for these actions? Well, it's very similar to what's happening in the United States with the police. So when the police behave terribly, and as they have in the United States, murdering innocent black people, shooting people in the streets, the problem is there is no entity to watch the police. Do you know what I mean? So you have the civilians, you have the police, and then if the police do something wrong, the people have to go to the police to tell them that the police are doing something wrong. This is the same situation in Iraq. Many of the people who are in our upper command, people who are higher ranking than I was in the military, they were also participating in these actions. So in order to report those actions, you have to go to the very same people who are conducting the very actions that you're trying to report on. So you can see this is a big dilemma. There is no mechanism, there is no avenue to hold these people accountable for what it is they're doing when they're in the combat zone, because the very people who are going to hold them accountable are also committing these atrocious acts. The other problem, and I think this is more implicit as opposed to explicitly being mentioned by people who are in the military or people who are in our command, but people generally understood that if you did speak out, there's a good chance that you could be put in a duty station or on a mission that could get you killed. There's also a good chance that one of your fellow Marines might have shot you if they had the opportunity, or at least put you in a position that would make you more inclined to be killed. That's also a very real dilemma. That's also a very real impediment to why it is people don't report those kinds of things. Now, I'm happy personally that I wasn't participating in the torture, particularly of prisoners. Those are sort of elements of the occupation where I feel like I can maintain some of my humanity. I was speaking with my friend from the platoon who is here for the weekend visiting my family for the holidays. And, we were speaking about these issues, and he reminded me that some of the people who did the most brutal activities, some of the people who laughed while they played with dead bodies, people who were killing innocent civilians, people who were torturing prisoners and thought it was entertaining, these are the same people who are having massive problems today. They are drug addicted, alcoholics, dealing with suicide, having friends who are committing suicide. Some of them are in mental health facilities. So looking back, I'm extremely pleased and extremely happy that I at least had enough sense to not participate, and at least I had enough moral fiber to not participate in some of the more brutal activities. Now, that being said, there's plenty of situations where I'm quite sure that I've killed innocent people. There's a lot of veterans, I think, who are in the same position. And so when people ask, why is it that veterans are killing themselves at 18 veterans a day on average in the United States? We've had over 6,000 veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan commit suicide. More veterans have killed themselves since returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan than died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A big portion and a big reason for that is because of these situations and these instances where people will act in brutal ways. And maybe in that situation, they don't think about it, but afterwards, when they're sitting at home with their family or their kids and they're reflecting on their situation or they're reflecting on their experiences in the war, for a lot of veterans who haven't come to terms with what it was we participated in, or for veterans who want to hide it or stash it away or kind of like, push it to the side, those things build up. And so, what I would encourage as well, people who are maybe watching or viewing this who are veterans, is to come to terms with those things, and to speak honestly and openly about it. Because the more it's bottled up, the more these experiences are hidden, not only from the general public, but from our family, our friends, our coworkers. I think it makes it more and more difficult for veterans to live a decent lifestyle. Now, that goes without saying. Our Iraqi and Afghan friends, our Syrian friends, our Libyan friends, our Palestinian friends, our Yemeni friends, our Somali friends, all of the people around the world who have been, hit with drone strikes, missiles, U.S. bombs, American-made weapons. There has to be, in my opinion, reparations for people across the Middle East, financial reparations. One of the greatest aspects of the Iraq Veterans Against the War, part of what drew me to the organization when I first joined the organization years ago, was the fact that one of their mission objectives for their organization was to provide the Iraqi and Afghan people with anything and everything they need from the West, but on their own accord. Meaning the West isn't just going to move in and start putting money here, putting money there, developing here, developing there. But to genuinely ask people in those countries what it is that's needed and what can be done. And I think we are in debt to those people, to the people in Iraq and Afghanistan and the broader Middle East and North Africa. People in the West generally, but specifically people in the United States, I think have a great debt to be paid for this. How can we make up for millions of people being displaced? What is there any way to even do that? Is probably an important question to ask.
We have a feeling that, and we have some documents, even from the USA government, that the partners in the Middle East financed the ISIS, the terrorists.
Right.
So I would like to ask you, what do you think if there are any other responsibilities from the big developed countries like USA in the spread of ISIS? And the second question is, since you were a soldier, if you think possible that something like ISIS, which is mainly based in Iraq, which is desert, and may not be defeated by the biggest army in the world like USA. I mean, wouldn't it be easy to defeat it if they just want it?
I'll answer your second question first. Okay, so if there weren't humanitarian laws, if there weren't international law, yes. I mean, if there was absolutely no regulations on killing innocent civilians, yes. The United States, with the largest and most powerful military in the world, could move into western Iraq, northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and just completely level the place. What's interesting is that some of the right-wing politicians in the United States have suggested such. They've said, look, we've got the most powerful army in the world. We have the most advanced military weapons in the world. Why won't Congress and the president just let us use these weapons to just destroy portions of Iraq and Syria? Because that's the only way that you would so-called or quote-unquote defeat ISIS militarily. That would be the only option, would be to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent civilians, just so we could kill the 20 or 30 or 40,000 fighters that ISIS claims that it has. That's an option, but that's without international law. That's if we don't care about people's lives. And the other thing to keep in mind, I'm sure you're aware of his work, the great author and journalist from The Independent, Robert Fisk. Robert Fisk, he's written article after article since the United States has started its quagmires in Iraq and Afghanistan, reminding people that many, many empires have died in the Middle East. There will be no powerful military that will conquer the Middle East. The Middle East has never been conquered, particularly by people from the outside. Alexander learned his lesson. The Romans learned their lesson. The Greeks learned their lesson. And empire after empire, including the Soviet Union, who had to learn their lesson in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and the United States now, who's learning the greatest lesson that all empires must learn to live with, which is you will not control and dominate the Middle East. These deserts will never be controlled, particularly by outsiders. That's what I think people in the West have to keep in mind. For over 1,000 years, empires have gone to the Middle East to die. That's where empires go to die, is the Middle East. And people have to keep that in mind. There is no military solution here. Getting to your first question, which I think is the important question here. What can the United States do? Very interesting. Seymour Hersh, one of our greatest investigative journalists in the United States, just came out with an article yesterday in the London Review of Books. What Hersh is finding out is that the military in the United States actually has a better idea of what needs to be done in the Middle East than Barack Obama, the Democrats, or the Republicans do. So what Seymour Hersh is reporting is that military generals over a year ago have been helping Russia and helping Assad go after ISIS. So there's a contradiction here. People in the military understand that Assad has to stay in power. And they don't, now whether they mean forever, whether they mean in the short term, that's debatable. You know, they're still debating that. But people in the military understand that without stable governments in the Middle East, that radical jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda, like Al-Nusra Front, like ISIS, will continue to spread their power. So what did the military do a year ago? Well, they subverted Barack Obama's orders. They went behind Obama's back and behind the administration's back to support the Russians who are fighting ISIS, to support Assad, who's, yes, he's killing innocent people, but he is also fighting ISIS. This is the big contradiction that we face in the United States. We have some people in the political establishment who want to get rid of who want to get rid of Assad. We have other people in the political establishment who want to keep Assad in power. So there are major contradictions within the elite in the U.S. The people who are making policy decisions in the United States are very split over this issue. What this means now for Obama, or as you mentioned, for the United States responsibilities, Obama and the West are having a hard time putting pressure on our so-called friends in Turkey. Our friends in Turkey who are allowing weapons to be shipped to ISIS, who are allowing fighters to cross over their borders, who are attacking our left-wing progressive friends, the Kurdish, in their regions, you know, killing left-wing movements. Also, some people speculate killing their own civilian populations or letting ISIS set off bombs like the bomb that was set off.
Or sell oil.
So you have oil revenue. So who do we really need to be going after, as you mentioned? And I think this is becoming redundant for a lot of people, but it is something that needs to keep, we need to keep mentioning this until the United States changes its policy towards the Qataris, the Saudis, the Jordanians, the United Arab Emirates, the Turks. All of those policies have to be changed. If we know where the money is coming from. You know, we know that there's Al-Qaeda elements in Pakistan and that they have a good relationship with the government in Pakistan. We know that the money from elites in Saudi Arabia are going to fund, and in Qatar are going to fund ISIS groups. We know that. That's where we need to put the pressure on. People like Phyllis Bennis are 100% correct when they say that there is absolutely no military solution to what is happening right now in Syria and Iraq. The United States has to stop supporting regimes like Saudi Arabia, like the regime in Jordan, like the regime in the United Arab Emirates, like the regime in Qatar, like the regime in Pakistan. These are governments that are extremely corrupt, killing their own people, chopping the heads off of political prisoners, and as pertains to our conversation here, funding and supporting the group that the ISIS, the organization that the United States is supposedly the #1 enemy of, you know. So these are the great contradictions that we live with right now. We have the military in the United States. This is amazing. The military has more political sense than Obama and the people who are in our political office. This is truly an amazing development. You know, so for Seymour Hersh to publish this article yesterday, I think personally was very, very important to our understanding what's been going on over the last year in Syria particularly. And it turns out the military has a better idea of what needs to be done with ISIS. And the U.S. military has been putting extreme amounts of pressure on the Obama administration to put pressure on Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Pakistan to try and rein in these elements that are supporting, funding, and allowing ISIS fighters to operate, either within their countries or supporting them abroad. This is truly an amazing development.
You mentioned in your article al-Baghdadi, the leader
Yes.
of ISIS. And from our research, it turns out that he was a prisoner in Camp Bucca. Did you saw Camp Bucca when you were in Iraq?
No, I personally did not.
Okay, and then amazingly, it was released.
Yes.
He was sent to the Iraqi government or forces, and then it was released. Do you have an idea of what happened? How it is possible?
How it's possible that he was released specifically? I don't know I do not know the details as to why it was he's released. I mean, what I would say though, and what I'm comfortable saying, is that I wouldn't be surprised if it was arbitrarily done. So if people, I mean, because part of what I think we have to be very careful about is that there's a lot of elements out there, critical elements on the left, even, people on the right, but, more critical elements, I guess, who, like I did an interview yesterday with a Russian radio program, and they were essentially trying to say that the United States, like coordinates these actions and let al-Baghdadi out of jail so that way he could go and create ISIS, so then that way the United States would have a reason to stay there and all of this. I think we have to be very careful here. Number one, until we have the evidence that would prove such, I think there's no reason to have the conversation. We need evidence that would prove that that is the case. Because otherwise we're speculating. This is all speculation. I also think it's really important to recognize that our partners around the world, because there's this idea now that the United States is purposely creating chaos, so that way we just have to stay in the Middle East forever. But it's really not the case. I mean, and it's not the case on many levels and for many different reasons. Even the Israelis right now are arguing that Assad should probably stay in power. The Israelis are that worried of what will happen if there is a series of stable governments that are overthrown in the Middle East. So there's contradictions there. We have contradictions with our allies in Europe. We're getting a lot of pressure in the United States from European leaders and civilians in who live in the European Union, who are telling the United States, we can no longer withstand this influx of refugees. There's so many refugees now, as you know better than I do, coming to Europe, that a lot of our European allies are telling the United States, we can no longer participate in these kinds of crazy actions overseas. And I think the Italians and the French are learning from their experience in Libya. What did they do? We blew apart the country. NATO bombs the country, bombs it to pieces. And what happens now in Libya for the last 3-4 years? Complete chaos, complete disaster. Now, who does this help? Maybe it helps a couple weapons manufacturers. Yes, okay, their money goes up, so on. But is this really helping the U.S. government? I mean, do we have more control in the Middle East than we do 10, 15 years ago? No, we have less control. Europe, tons of problems because of the refugee crisis. Now they are putting pressure on the United States saying, look, we can no longer bomb and occupy all of these countries in the Middle East. You guys live across the Atlantic Ocean, so we don't really have to deal with it. But you guys in Europe, our allies, particularly our military allies, you guys are the ones who are going to deal with these consequences before we will. You're already dealing with it. And there's also, as I mentioned, there's contradictions within the actual U.S. military political establishment. People who want Assad to stay in power, people who think we should have kept Mubarak in power, kept Gaddafi in power, kept Saddam and Assad in power. There are other people who are arguing that the United States should be supporting so-called democratic movements within the Middle East, militant movements. There's a lot of different strands of thought. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So yes, they released al-Baghdadi. He leaves the prison, probably for arbitrary reasons, probably didn't think he was much of a threat. Honestly, Claudio, there's so many so many prisoners in the United States, I'm sorry, in Iraq, held by the United States, that sometimes prisoners would just be released. People who shouldn't have stayed were kept captive for many, many months. And there were people who should never have been released, who were released. And none of this was conspiracy. This was simply incompetence. And this is what I think we have to start understanding, is that the military is very incompetent. The CIA, the U.S. government is very incompetent. People who have spent time within the military understand, that the military doesn't get what it wants all the time. And neither does the CIA and neither does the U.S. government. Because there's this view that I've started to recognize that people around the world sort of believe that, like, the U.S. government and the CIA, they just run everything. So it's either the CIA and Mossad, from Israel, who are kind of like running the show in the Middle East and, pulling the strings on the puppets, And yes, to some degree this is true, but I think we have to be more nuanced, and I think we have to be more complex in how it is we understand that these things happen.
What do you think the objectives, the goals of ISIS are now? Because you say that, the USA army was there and they hate you, but in fact, they're bringing terrorism in Paris, in French, in Brussels, in UK. So what do you think they will do now? And why do they bomb Europe and not USA?
Well, I mean, I think there's two good angles we could take there. I mean, number one, I do think people in Europe, what I've noticed is that I think a lot of people in Europe are very naive to the history that Europe has played in North Africa and the Middle East. So in the last 2 or 3 decades, the world has basically understood that, yes, the United States is the biggest aggressor in the world. Okay, so, many people around the world understood why 9/11 took place, but they know that the United States is the major hegemonic military power in the world and has been acting in the most brutal ways in the last 2-3 decades. But prior to that, people in the Middle East remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They remember how the Middle East was broken up by British and French generals. People in Syria remember why their country was formed and rebellions that were put down by French colonial masters. People in Iraq remember that the British were the people who drew the lines. When we were patrolling in Western Iraq, we would often run against people during the elections season that would tell us we don't live in Iraq. They didn't even believe in Iraq. For them, it was a European creation. They said we live in Mesopotamia. People in the Middle East remember these things. And as I mentioned earlier in the interview, the French in Malaysia, they remember. The Algerians remember. And this colonialism from the Dutch, from the British, from the Italians, from the French, from the Belgian, look, and of course from the U.S. and the U.S. empire over the last 250 years, but look what it has created. Look what the imperialism and the colonialism from Europe and the United States has created in the last 500 years. The entire continent of Africa in many ways is absolutely destroyed. This is a continent that was raped and pillaged by European colonial powers for centuries. It's the same in Latin America, and it has taken people in Latin America decades and decades to finally fight off U.S. imperialism and U.S. influence. And the people in Venezuela are understanding even today, with the U.S. having less influence in the region than it has ever had, we still have enough influence to dictate that a right-wing party received the most votes after 15 years of socialist revolution in Venezuela. Okay, so in the Middle East, why would people do this to people in Paris? Is it justified? No. Is it okay to do? No. None of this is okay. But I do think that there's a level of naivety for people in Paris to ask, why do they hate us? Freedom, fraternity, liberty, brotherhood. My goodness, this is such a wonderful place. Well, except if you're from Algeria, except if you're from Africa, except if you're a Muslim, except if you want to wear your hijab as a practicing Muslim in public. These are the kinds of insults that Muslim people have had to deal with in Europe for many, many, many decades. And So does that mean it's okay? Does that mean it's justified to attack innocent people in Paris? Absolutely not. However, I think it is very naive, and I think it is very disingenuous for people in Europe to ask, oh my goodness, why do they hate us? I'm not quite sure the second part of your question. You asked another question other than why people in Paris, why would they attack people in Paris? You asked one more question, and I can't remember it.
What are the objectives, the goals of
Well,
ISIS?
the objectives are clear. I mean, the worst part about the objectives for ISIS is that the West is falling into their hands. So what ISIS wants is a clash of civilizations. What did Al-Qaeda want? We have to go back to Osama bin Laden's fatwa that he released in 1998. You know, the fatwa that he released in 1998 was very clear. Here are the reasons we are opposed to U.S. occupation. Support for Israel. Basing troops in Mecca and Medina, occupying Iraq, torturing our people. They went down the list, very clear list. This is why we do not like the U.S. What was their goal? Their goal was to bankrupt the United States and to get the United States involved in a never-ending military conflict in the Middle East. This is ISIS' goal, because they understand. This group understands that if we continue to strike civilian targets in, say, Italy, France, Great Britain, the United States, people in the West are going to be more inclined to not only, one, allow their leaders to send military to the Middle East and get involved in never-ending wars, but also, two, at home, they're going to strip civil liberties. The United States is falling apart. You know, they're being spied on. People in the United States, their phone calls are being listened to. Their text messages are being swiped up. Their emails are being read. We are the most surveilled country in the entire world. You know, much worse than the East German Stasi state, worse than any other propaganda or state security system in the history of the world. This is what's happening in the United States. So these are ISIS understands this. Al-Qaeda understood this. Al-Qaeda understood that if we could get the United States involved in a never-ending military battle in the Middle East, we're going to bankrupt the United States. People in the United States are going to allow their freedoms and liberties and civil liberties and rights to be taken away by the government in the name of security. And
That's
then
the same that is happening in Europe. Just to tell you.
And what is the other part of this? They're allowed to frame the discussion. So then when you have people like Marine Le Pen, when you have people like Donald Trump come out, this is the two sides of the same coin. This is ISIS, but in France, this is Marine Le Pen. In the United States, this is ISIS on one side of the coin and Donald Trump on the other side of the coin. They both feed off of each other. So then Le Pen and Trump can go to the public and say, see, we told you so. The Muslims, there's no way to live with them. This is a clash of civilizations. We have to be engaged in this lifelong struggle. It's our civilization versus their backwards, barbaric civilization. This is how people like Le Pen and Trump continue to gain power. This is how people like Netanyahu continue to gain power. You know, there are two sides of the same coin. And I think we need to keep that in mind, because what ISIS wants more than anything is for people like Le Pen and people like Trump to continue to gain political power. This is perfect, because now we're in a never-ending war, and what they can do is they can go to fellow Muslims and they can say, see, we told you so. People in the West, they're not really tolerant people. They won't really deal with other cultures very well. We told you people in the West are a bunch of maniac killers who are racists, and they want to kill all the Muslims and they want to oppress Muslim people. That's the game, you know.
Okay.
And the more and more people fall into this trap of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, the more and more ISIS is going to get exactly what it wants.
Okay, last question for you. Now, since the end of the Cold War with Russia, now for the first time we have some tension between Russia and the United States. And so what do you think the role of Putin in the Middle East, also in the world, is? And I would like to ask you if people in USA are likely to to want a third world war, or just they don't want any tension with Putin?
No, most people don't. So let me answer your second question first. Most people do not want a third world war with Putin. Most people in the United States, I don't think, even understand what is happening with Russia. So the way that Russia is portrayed in the Western media is as being the oppressor, the aggressor, the violent, totalitarian government, corrupt leader. What's interesting here, though, however, with Putin, is there's a lot of right-wing people in the United States who love Putin. So, Putin just the other day said that his favorite candidate in the U.S. presidency so far is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said that Putin is his favorite world leader. So this is where I find a lot of interesting things. Because my leftist friends, my, very far left friends, they also have a positive view of Putin. I find this very interesting. We have far right who supports Putin, and even Assad. One of our former leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, the infamous white supremacist organization in the United States, has come out in support of Assad. So this is interesting times. These are crazy ideological times, in my opinion. What's the role that he could play? I mean, I tend to agree with people like Robert Fist and Patrick Coburn, Vijay Prashad. Yes, they have an interest, but I think instead of focusing on Putin, instead of focusing on Russia, I think what the West, or what we should be doing, I think, is thinking about institutions and the way that states function. So the tensions, and how do I'll bring this back to after the Cold War ended. So the wall falls. What does NATO do? NATO expands its borders to the east and continues to gobble up smaller countries in Eastern Europe, moving all the way to a couple years ago to Ukraine, where now you have a situation in Ukraine where the U.S. is now backing in opposition. Russia is now trying to take care of its borders, make sure that there's security, make sure that there's economic stability. They have a right to do so. Russia is absolutely right to do so. At the same time, however, we have to keep in mind that the United States has interests, Russia has interests, and just like the Cold War, what I think decent activists, people who are thinking about these issues should be contemplating is during the Cold War, who were the primary victims of the Cold War? It wasn't the people of Russia, and it wasn't the people in the United States. It was the people in Latin America. It was the Cubans. It was the Nicaraguans. It was the Congolese. It was the people in the so-called third world who paid the heaviest price for Cold War policies. And we're still living with those Cold War policies. What a journalist and author, Christian Parenti, calls the catastrophic convergence. What's playing out in the Middle East and North Africa? A legacy of Cold War weaponry. So what comes along with that Cold War weaponry that was left behind by Russian and American proxy forces? Also, ethnic tensions, religious tensions, and all of the different gangs and proxy armies and militias that were created within the context of the Cold War. So that's the legacy of Cold War militarism. Easy access to small arms throughout the Middle East and throughout North Africa. The other aspect of the catastrophic convergence, neoliberal economics. So at the same time that the world is implementing austerity measures across the globe, in some parts of the world, as I mentioned, particularly North Africa and the Middle East, there is a large number of weapons laying around. So now you can imagine maybe how bad things would be in southern Italy if there were thousands of RPGs and AK-47s laying around, easy to access, outside forces pouring money and weapons in, at the same time you're experiencing 20, 30, 40, 50% unemployment. This is the situation. Now, on top of this, the third aspect of the catastrophic convergence, according to Parenti, is climate change. So we have a situation like in Syria. You have legitimate political concerns. You have outside forces trying to dictate what different proxy elements within the societies do. You have weapons laying around from the Cold War, easy access to weapons, and ethnic and religious tensions that were primarily created within the Cold War context. Then to add on top of these elements, you have climate change, severe drought, the worst drought that Syria has experienced in over 500 years, 80% crop failure, 90% livestock loss. And where did that happen? In northeastern Syria, the portion of Syria that is now controlled by ISIS. So we have to think about all of these things. We have to think about how militarism overlaps with Cold War policies, overlaps with neoliberal economic policies, and how all of this is taking place in a context of runaway climate change. So who do I see benefiting from U.S. bombs and Russian bombs? No one on the ground. You know, I don't see people in Syria or in Iraq or in Afghanistan begging for the Russians to bomb. And it's the same in the United States. If every single refugee that is questioned or who has a conversation or an interview in the mainstream news media or an alternative news media, they all say the same thing. Please stop bombing our country. They don't care if it's U.S. bombs. They don't care if it's British bombs, Australian bombs, Russian bombs, Jordanian bombs. They want people to stop bombing their country. They know the more bombs that are dropped, the more blowback will eventually come, the more human casualties, the more society will continue to crumble. They understand these things. And so do I think Putin is playing a positive role in the Middle East? No, I think he's protecting his interests like every single nation state in the world protects their interests. He has interests in the Middle East. The United States have interests in the Middle East. What worries me is that the smaller people, you know, the people who are caught in the middle of this are the people who are the primary victims. You know, I've got two great friends of mine who are in Ukraine right now shooting a documentary film, telling me the same thing. The primary victims of what has been happening in Ukraine are not Russian forces or NATO forces. It is the people who are stuck in the middle. It is the innocent civilians. It's the women and children. It's the men who don't want to align themselves with either side. These are the primary victims of these wars. This is what I think we should keep in mind.
So, Vincent, you're an activist, right?
Yes.
So which is the organization, please? Can you remind us?
Yes, well, these days I write primarily for Telesur English. I also work with a group called Veterans for Peace. So please I would check out Veterans for Peace. I would also check out Telesur English. And let me think, what other groups? You know, I would tell people who are going to watch this to check out what's happening domestically with Black Lives Matter, the Asada Youth Project, the Black Youth Project, Asada's Children. These are great, great organizations who are fighting against militarism domestically. You know, police militarization at home, the killing of young black people. This is no different, you know, when we were on the streets of Ferguson in St. Louis. Young black kids holding up Palestinian flags. You know, the images are extremely familiar, Claudio. I mean, you're talking about, you know, Israeli tanks, armored vehicles, you know, soldiers decked out in state-of-the-art weaponry, and then Palestinians throwing rocks. You know, it was the same image in Ferguson.
The same old story. So it was very interesting to speak with you, and I really hope to have you back here in some time to comment, to discuss about future, what happens in the world, okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will. Yes, I promise. I'll come back.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, my friend.